this panel is pretty much everything games. So I know a lot of people in here might play games all the time or strictly business people. I'll kind of do a rough overview of what this panel could be about and what games are. So I like to kind of look at it as games are everything media combined. It's not just specific things. You have writers and programmers, artists, people that market the game and handle the money, your business aspect, people that do sound. It really is everything, and I think everyone up here today can answer questions about any of those because they all deal with that. But before I get into that, the questions from the audience, I'll have them introduce themselves, so I can start with Joe.
Okay. So I'm Joe Willmon. So my career, I've mostly been on the business and production ends of it. So I started at a small company called K2, then moved on. I worked for Blizzard for a little while, and then now I work at Unity doing developer relations. So if you ever work with Unity, you might end up working with me at some point.
I'm Phil Tibitoski. I'm the president at Young Horses, Inc. We made a game called Octodad and then went on to make a game called Octodad Dahlia's Catch that came out back in 2014. Did pretty well, and now we are our own studio. I'm working on a new game.
I'm Erlandson. I'm co-founder at Topstitch Games in Seattle. We're building a game called Treadnoughts that's in early access right now, and we also do contract work for larger companies.
I'm Karl. I write plugins for game developers. Specifically, we do 3D modeling.
That's it?
That's it. That's everything.
Cool, thank you. So obviously, ProBuilder. Yeah, it's called ProBuilder, and we're actually giving away 2 licenses of that at the end of this panel. So stick around if you want a chance to win one. So yeah, awesome panelists. They really have a wide coverage of game development. And we have 2 mics. Well, they're not there. They're just the mic stands. But if you line up at them, I'll know you have a question, and then I'll repeat it. So you can just shout it out, and I'll repeat it.
I don't know, maybe they can come up to me.
Yeah, you can
Just hand down the mic.
So any time starting now, you can come up. Awesome, you already have a question. And you also, if you look in the bottom right corner, and it'll switch slides too, we have a hashtag AskBlog17. If you don't want to come up and ask a question, you can tweet out one, and then Haley will be passing me those questions. So yeah, first, ask a question before I get to you. What got you interested in the industry? And that could be anybody can answer that.
Should we go down the line here real quick?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So I was never not making games, I guess is a good way to put it. Like when I was a kid, I was like making games on paper, and I was, making games with Legos. And then when there was modding tools come out, I was modding like Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3, and right, like I always had to do these sorts of things. And so I never saw myself as being anywhere else. And honestly, the real world seems kind of scary anyway. So I think I fit mostly well in the game industry. And so it just felt like it was something that had to happen. And so I just had to figure it out and get there.
For the longest time, I wanted to work at a bigger studio like Bungie or somewhere like that, just because I loved their games and thought like making something that big would be really cool. But as I got further and further through school, I kind of realized that the amount of creative control and actual input into what happens in those games becomes less and less, or at least more specialized as you work in bigger and bigger companies. And I had seen a lot of these smaller studios like Team Meat with Super Meat Boy, or Gaijin Games, which is Choice Provisions now, working on like the Bit Trip series and stuff like that, be able to make kind of whatever they wanted to. And as digital markets allowed people more and more room to release things and publish things on their own, I kind of realized that that was the direction I wanted to go in with my own career. And kind of the reason making games is like, it may seem trivial, but like if you can bring like a little joy into someone's day, even for like a 20-minute span, like I think that's worthwhile. So that's why I'm in it.
Yeah, my origin story is kind of funny. A family friend brought over a stolen version of Adobe Flash MX on like a old CD, and I just started playing with that and making animations. And one day I had more fun making a scene select screen and doing that basic programming than actually doing the animation. And I was like, all right, maybe I should try doing some games. And from there, I was just in the right place at the right time. I started making Flash games when there was no content. So I got to ride that wave of just like having a product that was in high demand, and just kept doing it, never stopped doing it.
So yeah, I had kind of the same thing. I was always making games, starting with the TI-83 Plus calculator, which is an awesome platform for learning programming. And then, I moved into modding when I was in high school and college. I loved modding Half-Life 3 and later Left 4 Dead. Sorry?
You love modding Half-Life 3? That is my favorite game.
Oh, no.
There it is. It's announced, finally.
You heard it here first. From the guy who didn't actually finish Half-Life 2.
Oh, no.
But I love modding it, weirdly. Yeah, I love making...
You just got so inspired you had to stop playing. Will do.
Anyways, always been making games, and I really enjoy that, so that's what I did.
I feel like I should say I have not always been making games. Like, I didn't make a game until I was in college.
Oh.
I've always liked them, and I messed around with, like, Blender or something like that, trying to make skins for Black and White 2 or something like that, and failing horribly. But I didn't actually make anything until I was in school. So don't feel bad if you haven't started yet, because you can pretty much start at any time, any age.
Yeah, calculators are
absolutely.
cheap.
We can head to that question if you want.
So, what has been your experience with just making a game, releasing the game, versus putting it on early access and then eventually releasing the game, versus something like Dwarf Fortress, where he released the game and, updates it once in a while? Like, what has been your experience with each of those and overall, sales?
So I'll repeat that question just so we got the recording. So what is your experience with the different types of releasing types? So like making a game, releasing it, making a game, putting it into early access, working on it, then releasing it, and then she mentioned another game which would she released it and then update it afterwards. So what's your experience with that and the sales that you found with that?
I mean, I've only done one commercial release, technically, and it was the kind of traditional route, or at least in the way that it's sold, and that we finish the game and then you just sell it. I think it really depends on the kind of game you're working on as to whether or not something like early access or active development, where you're writing in a blog and telling people about like each week that you're working on the game, and whether that is appropriate for what you're working on, and it kind of just depends on you and your game.
Yeah, I actually misspoke earlier when I said my game is in early access. It's in alpha, which means we have a free demo out. But as a general rule of thumb, both of the models you described can work, depending on the type of game. The general sales chart looks like you have a big spike on your launch week, and then depending on how big that spike is, you'll have a long tail where you'll continue to sell copies proportional to the size of that initial spike. But there are also these great exceptions to the rule. I think Dwarf Fortress is one, like you mentioned, where you'll launch the game and it will completely bomb or not get much attention at all, but you'll get like a really crazy growth graph that can even go exponential as you continue to add features and build like buzz organically. So both models are viable. I think some are more viable than others depending on what type of product you're building. Something like Octodad is probably going to do better with an initial release and then a long tail.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also though, there's kind of a third mode where games are becoming more and more of a service as time goes on, where you have to. It's kind of expected that you're going to support this game for 3 or 4 years in terms of fixing bugs or releasing new free content and levels and stuff like that. If you're looking for something successful or that's doing early access in a good way to kind of look to for inspiration, I would look at something like Nuclear Throne by Vlambeer. They do a really great job of, well, they're actually finishing that up now, but they did a really great job of weekly gathering feedback from players, incorporating into the game, streaming and showing like what they're working on, what they're doing, and why it's important. And I think they gave a better insight into what making a game is really like than a lot of developers in early access, where maybe you get an update once a month or something like that.
So actually, I'm interested with Joe. You worked at Blizzard and then Reloaded. At both those companies, did you see any differences when it came to how you're actually going to make the game and then sell it?
I mean, yeah, there's huge differences in how you're going to make it and how you're going to sell it, right? Like a smaller company, like Reloaded K2 that I work for, you're hugely dependent on pushing out your content all the time. That's the only way that you're going to get any kind of marketing. That's the way you're going to bring players back. You can send out email blasts, right? Whereas somebody like a Blizzard is going to have like a 5 to 7 year plan for all these types of games. They don't need to be as dependent as content because the content is pretty evergreen by itself. And so you can go quarterly or maybe sometimes even yearly, depending on what you're putting out there. And so if you're trying to decide on what your like initial like hit the street commercialization plan is, it kind of starts with where your head is at and what you're prepared to support. Because definitely, and maybe you guys can chime in on this, when you get to the end of making a game, it is the worst thing in the world, and you hate that game, and you question every decision you've ever made leading up to that point. I think it's like Cliffy B who says that there's the first 90% of game development and then the second 90% of game development, and that second 90% is just the worst. Like honestly, you have to be ready and prepared for it. And I guess where I'm going with this is you can be like, okay, I just need to put it out there. I just want to get it out and then just have people see what they think about it. And you actually need to be in a place where you're prepared to support this. You have plans, you have strategies, you're ready to do stuff.
Yeah, there's usually like a 3 or 4 month period there where the game is technically already done, ideally, where you're also then preparing launch trailers and launch sales and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that has to be prepped like way ahead of time, especially depending on what platform holders you're working with, like Sony or Microsoft or Steam or whoever. I think really, if you're trying to decide like which of these routes to go in terms of early access or just a normal release or a service, it should start with, at least with us, it does start with the game and kind of seeing where that goes before making a decision on that. Same thing with platforms. Like we don't start saying we want to make an early access game for PS4. We start and figure out what the game is and then see what best fits whatever that game is.
I guess touching upon what you kind of said that in between there, looking for how you were going to actually put the game out there for the first time. And you mentioned marketing, both of you did. How do you go about, what's your process of making sure your marketing plan fits with that core idea of what the game is about? And I know people have trouble, there's tons of games that come out every day, and a lot of them are never seen. So how do you think developers need to go about actually getting their games seen versus, just under the rug?
It's all you.
I have a great analogy for this. In terms of like a practical action plan, I think that my co-founder sat me down the other day because I was kind of freaking out. I was looking at some numbers and like I was hyping myself out a little bit. I'm like, how are we going to sell this game? It's indie-pocalypse. There's so many products out there. I know I have a good product, but I'm just scared I can't get it in front of people's faces. And he said, dude, you're doing a good job. Selling the game is kind of like playing Quidditch. There's 2 ways to win. You can put the work in with the quaffle and make your posts on social media, show your game at expos, get people to sign up on the mailing list by putting it in their hands, and that's working. You're going to slowly build some credit, but you also have to be chasing that snitch. And we're doing pretty good on the snitch. Like every day you got to be like talking to major publishers, like looking for a big promotion with the right partner. And you also put that kind of work in at expos when the right people are coming up and seeing your game, or like a big figure from the press, something like that. So there's 2 ways to win the Quidditch game, and I think the right way to do it is to pursue both things, always.
I mean, I think part of it is entirely dependent on if you're starting off or if you've had a previous hit or a previous game release. If you play to your same audience that you had before, or are you finding an entirely new one? For us, it was about getting the game in people's hands or in front of them as early as possible and like gauging those reactions, trying to figure out what kind of people they are that are interested in the game and like what they enjoy and why they enjoy, if they do, what you're showing them, and then kind of heading in that direction. What we noticed with the first Octodad that kind of helped us with the direction for the second one is that content creators and streamers and YouTubers and stuff like that were latching onto it because for some people it was almost more fun to watch people play the game than play the game themselves, which was fine for us because then we focused on being as kind as possible to those types of players and making it a game that's accessible to everyone and a game that is kind of the same. Everyone who plays it has the same starting point in that they're terrible at it. But that kind of unites people because then they can all kind of fight to try and be better at it together, rather than some people being intimidated by others because they're like, well, they're extremely good at this and I'll never be that good, so I'm not even going to bother. And we kind of use that as a through line throughout development and promotion in trying to just reach a very broad audience rather than a niche one, but having a clear direction as to what that target audience was, rather than, well, I want everyone to like my game. So.
And you kind of have to decide who you are and what your philosophies are, because that's going to seriously impact what all of your commercialization plans are, right? Like at a Blizzard, for example, or any large company, right? Like you kind of have some very specific snapshots that you are showing of the game, and you're getting people enticed, and you want them to come into it, and that's cool. That works fine for like AAA productions. But there's this one game I've been following. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's called Ooblets. It's being made in Unity. Super cool. They have been streaming almost their entire development ever since they had an art test, and that's cool because it's a very low-key game where it's like the players are on this collaborative ride with the developers, and so I'm watching that all the time and kind of like rooting for them. And when they got picked up by Double Fine, I was like really excited, and I feel like this sense of ownership over this game that I have nothing to do with.
Yeah, if you're looking for a game to look at right now that's probably doing the best job of marketing itself, they're a two-person team outside of Double Fine, and they're just doing like an amazing job of being in front of people all the time with the GIFs that they post on their Twitter all the time. They've been posting GIFs since I think they started development, since they had a concept, which is scary, but it's built them an audience over time, and now they have a huge audience. And Ben, who's their marketing person and I think an engineer on the project, recently put up like a Patreon post all about their kind of marketing philosophy and their design philosophy, and how making your game is marketing to some degree if you want it to do well, in that anytime they're making a design decision, it's like, well, is this being kind to the player, because that's their kind of their tenet, and then the same thing in the marketing, and it's just, is it cute and kind? And I don't know, it's done really well for them.
Yeah, you don't tend to think about it, but I think I might. Okay. You don't tend to think about it, but almost every design and aesthetic decision you're making in that process, those are marketing decisions. You may not realize it, but every single thing you're doing ties into how well people are going to receive it and play it and then talk to their friends about it. Because what is the cool thing they're going to tell people? Like, oh, I have this game where it's Pokemon meets Animal Crossing and you have cool sweaters, right? That's kind of interesting, right? And not a whole lot of games have that. So it's good to think about.
Yeah, it's striking a balance between making what you want to make and then making something that other people will enjoy. And I think you have to lean a little bit into that latter direction, at least if you're looking to do something commercially, which ends up being more fun anyways, because personally what I get out of it is watching other people enjoy it.
Dude, there's nothing like the rush of like watching somebody playing your game and they just like super love it, and you kind of feel like a proud parent, I guess.
I would think too, it's actually read, like, you have a game in early access, or alpha, sorry, and I bet you're finding too, the marketing for that is difficult, but do you see that you need to be constantly looking at what no one else is doing? Because you can't be looking at what's happening 2 years ago and how people marketed 2 years ago. It's constantly changing.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, like look at PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. That was an established genre, kind of. Like, there were a few games in the genre, but he broke through and brought it to the mainstream, and everybody in retrospect is like, yeah, of course, it makes sense. So
hindsight's 20/20 on everything, yeah.
Yeah, hindsight's 20/20. There's kind of like this black swan question, right? Where you're like, yeah, you're always trying to do weird things and like, come up with a game that's different, and like you can kind of come up with a plan. Like we have a pretty strong sense for how well our game's going to do on stream. Like we know that people will probably like to stream it because it's readable, and we're like leaning into that, like with the Ooblets, right? Like we're trying to make it GIFable, and you, like these guys mentioned, you got GIFable. Yes, GIFable and GIFable, both. Any way you pronounce it, you got to be able to read it. But you do that as you're working, and then I think a lot of people are scared to try weird stuff. A lot of people they'll like pull up Gama Sutra and like read a bunch of indie postmortems and like be
like, oh, this is exactly what I need to do, except that's what that person did 2 or 3 years ago, and then it's not going to work by the time you're done with it. It's a lot about paying attention to the news, what's going on in the market, how well other games are doing, and then trying to kind of project or estimate where you need to be at. Like even paying attention to art styles and stuff like that, and what's catching on. When we were starting our most recent game about 1.5 years ago, we were like, well, it seems like in 3 years it's all going to be low poly, kind of PS1 flat color, like that's going to be the big thing, at least within our space. And so we went a complete opposite direction because like Austin was mentioning, and we've all kind of been talking about, one of the hardest things is to stand out amongst other games. If you're making a 2D platformer, that's a lot harder to sell these days than something more esoteric. As long as it's relatable.
Yeah, there are different strategies that work too, right? Like I have some friends that are building a game and they're very focused on their IP. So they have a few characters that like, and they've tested this by just tweeting a bunch. And they have like 1 or 2 characters that they know people like. And now they're changing their whole game to just like really sell those characters.
Over time, you get better and better at knowing what you're good at and what you can do better than everybody else. And then if you can focus in on that and make it the core of what you're doing, you're usually heading in the right direction.
There's customers, but on the beginning side of it, how does that work for selling assets?
Pretty similar, actually. So talking about like Twitter and engaging your audience, that's something we do a lot. In terms of what we add to our product, so our big product's ProBuilder, 3D modeling software, and we do a lot of like tweeting and engaging with like people who use this tool and asking, what do you want? What are you using it for? What's not working? So yeah, I tweet out a whole bunch of things I work on that are half finished or I don't even know if they're going to work. And if it's exciting, then we'll continue. And if it's not, we'll drop it. So yeah, a lot of similar things. We don't necessarily have to predict what's going to be hot in 3D modeling because,
Yeah.
fortunately,
Well,
that's
you are 3D, like to some degree.
yeah. We're not on the vanguard of 3D modeling technology.
Wait, is it that easy? Because I have some feature requests.
You just tweet me. That's
All right, we'll do.
We have a question.
I was wondering if you guys have any major bits of advice for things to do during the development process of a game. So like while you're still coding or developing assets for it, if there's anything major advice.
You mean marketing-wise or things that you should do in the development process?
Things you should do in the development process, things to
Be thinking about marketing.
Yeah.
As early as
Yeah,
possible.
marketing.
If you're looking to sell it, if it's just like a hobby project, that's a little bit different. But if it's something you're looking to actually release, think about marketing earlier than you think you need to be thinking about marketing. Because a lot of people leave it to the end, and then it ends up being like a 2-month thing and no one knows about your game. Also, if you're looking to make it something that people enjoy, getting it in front of playtesters as early as possible and taking their feedback seriously, but not necessarily doing everything they suggest is pretty good.
And don't tell them that they're playing it wrong.
Yeah.
There was a phrase that they say at Blizzard, which is, we can't ship a developer in every box. And that's basically because your instinct when somebody's playing your game is to be like, no, you're doing that wrong. Like, you need to go there, you need to do that. And you need to just watch what they're doing and just stand back. You're not a part of that conversation at all. And then just try and react and then change things. Because players are going to know how they're reacting to things, but they're not going to know what the right thing is. So they might be like, put more enemies on level 4, but what they really mean is level 4 felt a little bit easy and it wasn't that fun. And so now it's up to you to figure out how to solve that actual problem.
Yeah, building the skill to intuit maybe what they want, but not what they say they want, is pretty important because a lot of the times people don't know what they want.
If I can add, if you were asking more on like the technical side of things, I see a thing a lot of people, game developers try to write their game as modular as possible and make it reusable and make everything as optimized as they possibly can right out of the box. My advice would be to prototype a lot, which goes in with what you were saying, is get it out in front of playtesters and have it not be perfect, just kind of blast out content and see what sticks.
Yeah, we usually have like a, 3 to 6 month process where we're just prototyping things, and then we end up throwing, even if we like land on an idea that we really like, we throw out that initial code base and kind of rewrite things because it's generally a mess. And also, if it's your first game, it's okay that it's a mess as long as it works.
Something that's worked well for me was to put content off as long as possible, create a vertical slice. Like, we started by making a minimum viable product that just showed our core mechanic. And then before we added more than 10 very simple maps, we just polished the crap out of that core. And it's done really well for us because when we show our game at conventions, or like when people look at our screenshots or our 10-second gameplay clips that we're posting on social media, it looks really juicy and polished, and they get interested. We could have spent 60 or 70% of that time on having 5 times as much content and then polished it, but by starting with a small amount and doing a really good job, it's helped us find the fun and make sure that people were vibing with it before we committed all the way.
Yeah, finding your hook and making sure that people actually will get to that hook within the first like 10 minutes of playing the game is pretty important, because otherwise, even if your game is like amazing, an hour in, no one's going to get there. Yeah, we could probably go on about this forever, so we should probably move on.
Go to the next question. Thank you, by the way.
Kind of going off somewhere, when from the developer side, do you think too much content is too much content? Like, for example, Fortnite has a great concept, but they just recently announced that they're adding in a battleground style mode, and I think that's a little bit too outside of what they originally planned.
The question was, when you're developing, how do you know how much content is too much content?
So I don't know if I have a direct answer to that, but I'm going to start talking, and we will see if we get to where that is. Right? Yeah. So I mean, it's part of what I was mentioning earlier. You kind of have to know who you are and what you're after and what your philosophies are. And it feels like if you have your whole game mode, you've decided everything that you want out of your game, and then all of a sudden there's another popular game, and you're like, okay, we're going to add that exact game as another game mode. It sounds like maybe you haven't actually done that. You haven't decided exactly what it is, because you should have this whole picture in your head of exactly what it is that you want to build. And then maybe that will change based on player feedback, based on input, based on your own whims, but you have a thing that you're driving towards. And I feel like when I worked at smaller companies, a really big problem with, I don't know, our content plans, everything, because we were trying to do everything. We were trying to do a little bit too much. And so it's just how much you're deviating from your philosophy, how much you're spreading your development team thin. Like, if any of you are engineers, or if you are producers that work with engineers, ask them how much they love having you change your mind and then implement new features and then kill that and then do another one, right? Like, nobody loves that sort of thing. So it's going to be very subjective and personal, I think. But if you're not sticking to your philosophy and you're spreading yourself too thin, that's too much.
Yeah, I mean, killing some of your babies is kind of a norm while making games, but you want to at least minimize that as much as you can so that people aren't just being like, well, screw this, guys, like I'm out of here. If you're looking to start a studio or work on a team, make sure that, like, the first step, I think, is to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what their goals are, and what kind of games they want to make and what kind of philosophies they want behind those. With Young Horses, it's making a game that can reach a broad audience through doing something that no one else would be stupid enough to do, basically. And that only we could kind of accomplish, which seems broad, but if you start asking yourself those questions when you're making decisions, and like, does this line up with our company kind of vision, which sounds a little lame, but is very useful, that often helps you make decisions on like, how big should this game really be? Who are we actually competing with? And what's actually necessary? Because it's very easy to jump from feature to feature as soon as you're like, oh, this would be cool and that would be cool, and oh, maybe we'll do this next, and then you just kind of end up with 20 things that are half done and none of them are good.
Yeah. I think your game's release date is directly proportional to how many features you're cutting and not how many you're adding.
I actually have a bunch of Twitter questions. So I like this one. I'm kind of going to add on something to it, too. So what trends are you seeing in the game industry, and how can your companies relate to it? I'm going to kind of tag on to the trends with monetization and how big games and small games are trying to earn money, and how are your companies reacting to that, and how you're going to kind of attack that problem.
Well, I mean, the easy answer there is monetization sucks and nobody likes it and it's a bad thing. But it has, I mean, at least the current trends, right? So for the DLC, the microtransactions, things like that. So when I was playing games when I was a kid in the 80s, games cost $50, which nowadays that would be $104.61. I actually looked that up. So games do not cost $104.61. They still only cost $60. So they're a lot cheaper. But the way that they've done that now is they have microtransactions. There's things that I don't have to buy. Like, I'm not super into cosmetics. I never buy cosmetic microtransactions. But some people are buying those things and they're paying for my game for me to play it. So that is super cool for me. I would have loved to have that sort of thing if I was 15. Especially, there are some games that I used to play when I was a teenager that are just not around anymore because they had no viable commercial plan. They had no trend. They had no microtransactions. They weren't following anything like that. And so you do have to stay true to who you are, right? And maybe who you are is you want to wring as much money out of a player as fast as possible. I don't advise that route, but I mean, it's something that I've certainly seen some people do, but you can also keep an eye on the long game and figure out, like, are you building a legacy? Are you building a brand? Do you want something that players are going to enjoy? And then maybe you can ease off the microtransactions a little bit. One of the companies that I worked for, one of our goals was, we said, well, this game does have microtransactions. That means people can technically pay us an infinite amount of money. But we actually engineered the way people could purchase things such that there was no point in doing that, right? At a certain point, you will have spent the maximum amount of money, and we don't want any more of your money. We don't want to pick your pocket, right? We just want to be rewarded, and we want you to pay us for our efforts. And then there's definitely going to be other companies. Like, I don't think that philosophy is the norm. I think other companies are like, fine, pay us as much as possible, as often as possible.
I mean, I think it really goes back to what your goals are. Yeah, there's microtransaction stuff, there's games as a service, there's early access. But depending on what kind of game you're making, depending on what kind, like, size studio you have, like, microtransactions, for example, might seem like an easy thing to do. Like, oh, I'll just put a couple things in there, they'll each $1, and I give the game away for free. I'll be a millionaire in no time. That's not the case. There's, like, a wild amount of research that goes into the psychology of why someone would want to buy something, like the entrance and exit to getting that and putting in their payment information and all that kind of stuff, that a small studio most likely does not have the resources to, like, properly set up. I'm pretty okay with that model as long as you can play through the game and then earn them otherwise, even if it just takes you more time. And if it's just like someone wants that sooner and faster because they're older and they don't have as much free time, whatever, that's their choice.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on that.
No, I'm wondering if we should be identifying trends beyond just commercialization practices.
Oh, yeah.
But
No,
I'm just trying to think.
So, I mean, there's a current problem. I don't know if it's a problem. There's a current change with Steam that it's kind of becoming oversaturated in that there are, like, thousands of games coming out all the time. And it's because they moved from a model where Steam representatives who represented developers would say, like, okay, these games are going to come out and this is when they're going to come out, and they are only coming out because we choose to allow them on the store. And that has, over time, through Greenlight and now Steam Direct and stuff like that, changed to where you can kind of self-publish pretty easily without much oversight, and so just more and more games are coming out, and so it's harder and harder to stand out among all those games. And there's a lot of chaff in there where people are trying to make quick things to make money. And so now more than ever, it's harder to get noticed, and I think you have to spend a lot more time making sure that whatever it is you're creating and working on will stand out amongst what everyone else is doing.
Interestingly, I think that as a result of the way that something like Steam is changing the delivery process for content, it's easier to get your product noticed if you're in an established niche. So I'm building a local competitive game, and I know that if I make a great local competitive game, I'll sell at least 2,000 copies, just based on the way that service is now feeding games to players that have a lot of games in that category, instead of booting up the front page and serving the 5 curated picks that are a result of the developer's relationship with the Steam content guy. So you can count on people that are very hardcore and dedicated to a certain niche seeing your product now. But
Like strategy games.
Like strategy games, for example. Yeah, like if I build a strategy game that is kind of unique and is high quality, I can look at the numbers and have a good idea of a minimum number of copies I can sell.
Yeah, I mean, for different platforms, there are different kinds of games that do well with different kinds of players, and it just takes a while of paying attention to what does well on which platform and when, and what kind of games there are, or at least what within those games is what's grabbing people. With Steam, for instance, like first-person puzzle games are usually pretty popular, like because of Portal and Half-Life, and which I consider kind of a puzzle game, and then Antichamber and things like that. There's like a through line there. There's a game that's coming out, I believe, this year called Manifold Garden. That's kind of in a similar vein. And knowing that and understanding, like, is the game I'm making appropriate for this audience or for this platform or store is pretty important. And then if you want it to be more popular there, you can find things that will kind of lure those players in, even if you're just trying to trick them into liking something that they might otherwise never look at.
There's still curators for these products too now, but now instead of it being the Steam guy You have like YouTubers that have, they select games that they like, right?
Yeah, they have curation pages for each of them, and they can say, like, these are my top 20 favorite games right now, and that I've done videos on, and then link to their videos and stuff like that. And a lot of players will look to those people because they're like, hey, I know this person likes the same kind of games I do, and I watch their videos, and I like them, and so I'll pay attention to kind of what they're pointing out. And honestly, a lot of time now you want more press from them than you do from traditional written press online or in print, which print doesn't exist much anymore.
Yeah, I think it's stronger than like getting a catch-all, mega feed site, even like IGN. Like I've seen games with great ratings on IGN that have had a lot of build-up, and then I look at their Steam numbers and I'm just like, really? That's it?
Yeah, if you're talking about review scores, those don't always line up with good sales. I think our Metacritic is still 69, and it's been that forever, but the game is done super well, and people like it, and like we get a lot of positive emails where people are telling us that they love it, but it's not critically acclaimed at all.
It's interesting because for like your game, it would never even occur to me to check the critical scores on it, right?
Right.
Like, I would look at it and be like, okay, I'm gonna be an octopus walking around in a suit. Of course, I'm gonna do that.
Yeah, because that's not the draw. Like, it's not a hardcore game where you're concerned about the challenge or at least in that way. And it's not like a graphical powerhouse where you're like, is the frame rate good and all that kind of stuff. It's just like ridiculous. You're like, this is super weird, and I need to tell someone else about it so we can play it together.
Your aquarium was really unrealistic, literally unplayable.
I mean, to be honest, though, we did go to the aquarium, the Shed Aquarium in Chicago, and also the Science and Technology Museums. They wouldn't let us into the kid exhibits. So we do have that in the game where they won't let you in certain places because you're without a kid because you're an adult. So we did take inspiration from that, but I guess we did take also a little bit of like creative freedom in interpreting it.
So I guess going off of the creative approach, because we talked a lot about the marketing and selling your game, in terms of coming up with the idea, and especially with a group of people and not just being one person, what are the difficulties and benefits of landing an idea, and how do you even get to the point of having everyone on the same page of an idea you're going to pursue?
Well, it's kind of it's tough because you need strong direction. Like I think you definitely need an auteur behind the wheel. You need somebody who...
You need a person who like will make a final decision
Yeah.
if there's like a dispute.
And your team has to trust that person completely. And the only case in which you'll have a team that'll trust a person like that completely and it will be a healthy working relationship is a case where they trust that person because that person is consistently making the right call and putting their ego aside and listening to their team when they're wrong. So it's tough to, and that's not something that some people just have. It's an emergent dynamic that comes from finding the right people and like working together a lot.
It's also a skill that you can develop.
Yeah, definitely.
Like we have quarterly review meetings where they're not just like performance reviews, but they're more like a team therapy session to some degree, where it's like, you've been really bugging me this quarter because you've been insisting we do this, but nobody else agrees with you and you won't let off of it, and like trying to work through that and improve. And we do that every quarter, and I think it does a good job of making sure any bottled up tensions get released and then there's no explosion where somebody storms out. But in terms of making sure you're on the same page or deciding on an idea or a concept. There's 8 people in my studio, including myself. We each bring like 7 to 10 pitches when we're looking to do a new game based on just things that we're interested in. We try to draw as much as possible from things outside of games. And like anytime we hire a person, we make sure they have like a diverse set of interests. Because when you're making games based on games, it becomes iterative and boring, or at least to someone who's been playing games for like 20 years. And from there, we kind of weed that down to 3 ideas out of 100 or so, just based on team votes. And no matter what your position at the team, whether you're in business or you're in audio or design or art or programming, you get votes and you get to pitch your ideas. Anybody can be the creative director of a project. It just depends on what project we pick. And then we prototype those 3, decide which one we think is best in terms of like, in terms of the current market, in terms of what the art style might be like, and in terms of if it's fun or not, obviously, or at least just gives the experience we want, and then go from there. And then otherwise, each of our members of our team are kind of heads of their own department because they have to be, because there's only 8 people. But they also kind of get the final say on something if it has to do with their department more than another. And that usually solves a lot of problems, and we've come to a point where everybody agrees that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, this is a problem that sounds extremely abstract when you think about it. You're like, oh, we're fine, right? Like, but it is so important. If this is written down, I would like bold it and underline it. Like, if you want to turn your best friend into your worst enemy, right? Just like make a game together when you have slightly different ideas of the game that you actually want to make. Like some person needs to be the absolute one in charge, and the other person actually needs to be okay saying, okay, it's this guy's or this person's turn, right? They get to be the one in charge this time, and then the next time around, maybe it'll be my turn. But we're making the vision that's in this other person's head, and I don't have access to it.
Yeah, I mean, game development is mostly about people and communication. You can be like the best programmer in the world, but if you're a jerk and like no one wants to work with you, it's not going to matter. And if someone's being toxic, it can kind of affect how everyone else is working and whether or not they feel comfortable being at your studio. They might leave, stuff like that. So having someone who's paying attention to that at all times is pretty important.
Yeah, how many people thought we were going to come up here and talk about, like, what's the best middleware to choose, or what your version control should use, or don't optimize your code too early? It turns out a lot of these things are kind of just solved problems, right? Like, you can go off, you can write code, you know that you need to refactor, you know that you need to QA, but all of these things that we're talking about are things that probably none of us had any idea when we were jumping into it. Like, marketing is super important. Do it from the first time you have a GIF, or be friends with your teammates and be willing to back off and say no. Like, these are all emergent things that are kind of like new and crazy, and we're always figuring out.
So I actually have a question. Who here is interested in getting into games at all? You can raise your hand. Okay, cool. So one of the questions, well, two of the questions. So what advice do you have for students, even it says a few years from graduation, but just anybody who wants to land a job in the industry? And on top of that, another question I love is, how can a busy mom give an 11-year-old son tools to become a developer?
Well, I'm going to immediately take this opportunity to plug Unity. So so she should definitely give her 11-year-old son or daughter Unity, because there's lots of good tools there where you can learn. And there's also there's actually specific programs that I know nothing about, so I'm not going to be specific at all. But it's kind of like little games that you can put on iPads that'll help teach kids kind of how to put their neural pathways down that area where they can think logically and start coming up with programs. But since I'm talking on the mic right now, to get into the industry, I still think video games is the most meritocratic industry out there. Like, I don't think I can think of another one. So just make games. Make a lot of games. Or whatever it is that you do that thing and see if you can have something to show people. Like, I'm still making my own games all the time now because you just have to.
I mean, you have to have the skill for sure, but I don't know if it's entirely a meritocracy. It's a lot about who you know.
Fair enough. Yeah, of course.
That's always advice I first give when someone asks me how to get into the industry is go make friends with people who are doing it. No one works in a vacuum. You need to work with people. And if you are friendly and people know who you are, and they know that guy is super friendly or she is like an awesome programmer and really great to work with, you're going to get a leg up over everyone else.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, being up here like this is a learned behavior for me. Generally, I'm pretty introverted, and I mean, people are fine. But like, I went to GDC a couple times as a student and like didn't know anybody and was just like standing at parties awkwardly. And like the whole reason I think I broke out of that shell is I had a friend of mine who had been in the industry for longer. And we were at like a Destructoid party and handed me like a sandwich tray and was just like, go serve these to people and like explain to them why they should want to eat this sandwich. And it sounds like really weird, but it helped in just being less afraid of just being able to go up to someone and say, hi, I'm Phil, nice to meet you, I do this, or I'm trying to do this, what do you do, or who are you, or whatever, and like, I don't know, trying to show general interest, genuine interest in who someone is and why they do what they do, and stuff like that has been super helpful. And in terms of giving, a father and their 11-year-old daughter or whatever tools to make games, I think Game Maker is a good start because it's 2D, it's a little bit less complex, and it comes with a lot of good tutorials, and you start out making things like Tetris or little plane shooters or racing games, and it's a good starting point. And also, you don't necessarily have to know how to program to use Game Maker. There's like a GUI, graphical user interface, where you can just kind of click and drag, and it's a lot about just logic, which anyone can do.
One thing that I kind of knew in the back of my head when I decided I want to do games, but didn't really sink in until I was working for somebody else, is that if you're passionate about games and you're working at a game company, your friend group is going to become your coworkers. You're going to stay there late. You're going to be spending all your time and energy with these people. You're not going to want to go home and play games. So after doing that for a year or two, I had this realization. I was like, look, I don't want to work for somebody else and do this. If I'm going to do this, it has to be with my friends at my company. A lot of my friends are happy working at big corps because their close friends are their coworkers, and they're very passionate about first-person shooters or MMOs, and those are, or AAA products. So that's another path. And if you want to do that, I think something I wish I had done if I was going to go that route is find what you like. Like if you like Civilization and 5X games, you should just build a 5X game. Start it quickly, finish it quickly, build a crappy one, and then build another one, and build another one. It will do you no favors to diversify and try lots of things and wear lots of hats and have a resume that says writer, designer, programmer, because there are a million of those people walking around awkwardly at GDC. But if you're a designer that loves 4X games and has made 4 of them or designed 4 of them, then you're going to stand out to the one person that matters to you, and that's the guy who's hiring at Firaxis.
Yeah, like knowing what kind of job you want and what they're looking for is pretty important. And it seems like a mystery, or it seems like it might be hard to figure out, but you can find these people and just ask them. Like, what do you look for in a candidate? What do you pay most attention to? What's most impressive? Are you working for a big studio or a small studio with big ones? Like Rui was saying, you have to like specialize and be really good at one thing, because that's most likely you're going to be just like painting the eyebrows onto characters or something, and that's it. Yeah, lash by lash. Or otherwise, if you're working at a smaller studio, we, like, for instance, do look for someone who has a diverse set, because everyone, since we're small, has to do like 3 different jobs. I do PR and marketing, and then I'm also biz dev and development, and then I'm also I do QA every day. And we have a writer who is also an artist, who is also a designer, etc. Our programmer is also our CFO. So it just depends on what your goals are. I think one of the greatest skills you can have overall for anything is being as self-aware as possible, and knowing when you're doing something that's not so great, or when you're doing something that doesn't really stack up against what the standard is for being seen as professional or good. And being able to admit that to yourself, or get that feedback from other people and take it in a constructive way instead of getting upset. Because being in this industry is a lot about taking feedback from outside sources and processing it to do something good with it.
It depends on how you handle it. Yeah, if you handle criticism well, and you will get a lot of it if you're making games. Gamers are very passionate people.
Passionate.
The people who make games
It's a
are
kind
also
word.
passionate.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really, everyone wants to see like the best product they possibly can. Like they want your game to be awesome, and they are only mean because they think that it could be better, and they have ideas. So taking that in a constructive way is great.
Everyone has ideas.
Right.
Lots of ideas.
So actually,
Hold on to this.
based on idea kind of thing, I have a Twitter question that asks, how do you determine if a concept has the demand to begin investing? But also, what tips and what are the steps you take in order to get funding? I know that's a big problem people find. Some people think making games costs tons. Some people think it costs nothing at all, but it's kind of in between. So yeah.
So did you guys ever go through the VC route, or when you guys were starting up? No? So for those not in the know, VC meaning venture capitalists, or it's like business incubators are a place that a lot of businesses get their start. And that's something I did out of college, actually, was I got involved with, OU has a great business incubator down by Miller's Chicken, which is a bonus. But they're great. If you're someone like fresh out of college wanting to make games on your own or start a business, and you have no idea what the heck like a 1040 ES form is, or like who you need to register with, how you get a company name, like getting involved with these people who are just there to help you grow is a really great place to start. So if you are interested in entrepreneurship, reach out to your community. There's probably people there to help you do that.
I mean, in terms of going back to networking, another important thing about that is if you're looking to start your own business, nobody on our team went to school for business at all. And we figured it out entirely by asking people we had met who had done it before. And also a lot of information is available online for free. if you know the right places to look.
And there's no substitute for just trying something and failing at it and just doing that over and over again, because that's one of the routes that I took.
Yeah, and then back to the question about like proving a concept, and then what was the second half?
I was just proving a concept and knowing when the right time is to invest in it or start your company fully.
Oh, okay. So one thing people like to leave out with Octodad, at least, is that the first game we released was basically a proof of concept, and it was free, and it was 45 minutes, and we just put it out online, and that got us a lot of traction, both with press and players and content creators, and that proved to us that at least people were interested, and then we were considering like whether anyone would actually pay money for something like this, a more professional, polished version of it. And initially we had talked to some publishers, done some pitching and stuff like that, and just like them giving the numbers of like, yeah, well, we want 45 to 60% of the cut of each sale. And we were just like, no thanks. From there, we started investigating, like crowdfunding at the time was becoming bigger, Kickstarter, stuff like that. And we just started to go that route after trying to kind of court a bunch of publishers. And that worked out for us. And our goal with Kickstarter, which I think is important, it was not to fund the whole game's development, but to prove that people actually wanted to pay money for it. And our goal was 20 grand, which is a lot of money, but not a lot of money, at least in terms of today's Kickstarter landscape. And also one of the reasons we grabbed hold of that is because it was what was popular and what people were writing about and what you got press for. Now it's really hard to get someone to write about your Kickstarter campaign because it's old hat and it's not interesting anymore. It doesn't get clicks. But yeah, our game we made on that amount of money, and then the rest of us, most of us either lived off of savings that we previously had or worked full-time jobs while we were working on the game nights and weekends, which is what I did. I was a programmer at a ad tech company, which was very boring.
I think Phil's right on the money, especially regarding publishers. And I think it extends to like, I mean, publishers are really going to be your VCs in this space, at least in my experience. But to me, the idea that a lot of people seem to have of like, I have this great idea for a game, I'm going to just barely start building it and get my team together, and then I'm going to pitch it to somebody and they're going to fund it. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, well, and also even if you're going to go that route, which it's like a perfectly fine route to go if you find the right partner, and there are a lot of like small boutique publishers now that are great, like Devolver or
Chucklefish.
Is it Chucklefish? What's the Fury one?
Raw Fury.
Yeah, Raw Fury. They're cool. Even if you're going to go that route, you still need to have like a prototype and be able to prove to them that it's something you can build.
You have to have a minimum viable product, and it has to line up with their brand. Like Devolver, a very specific type of games. But another option, like what I did was I started as a contractor. We like had one opportunity to do like a $3,000 learning game contract, which gave us like 2 months of runway, and just like quit my job and went for it. And we positioned ourselves in a way that we were confident. We were gambling for sure, but we were confident that if we developed like VR and AR skills, we knew that we could become self-sufficient.
That's super scary, though. We didn't quit our job, or at least I didn't quit my job until we had released the game, and then 3 months later, we're like, okay, it hasn't blown up. Like the tail didn't suddenly dive bomb and like screw us over. We can go salaried and like have health insurance and all that kind of stuff.
I think if you're young with no debt, then the risk is a little lower. And like
I had like 110 grand in debt at the time, so I wasn't going to go that route.
Yeah, but all I'm trying to point out is that there are other options, right? Like a lot of people don't think about contract work, but it's totally a viable route. Like
a lot of people do freelance stuff and then work on side projects and eventually push those side projects to be their main projects.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we just did. We just made the big decision to stop doing contract work and bet on our game. And that was as a result of putting out our demo, seeing that people were liking it, looking at the feedback we were getting, and then thank you. Yeah, but I think you should become self-sufficient in some way, and there are a lot of strategies to do that before you go all in. But the key is to just go for it. Just come up with a plan and try it, and have a finger in every pie or an iron in every oven if you prefer. Like we shotgun blasted like 5
None
games.
None of these work.
We tried 5 weird different products before we made the one that got us a big stable contract.
Right.
So like we did like a mobile VR game and like, you know, a bunch of weird little prototypes using Facebook's live reaction tech, and like those were all small fish, but we found one doing AR that panned out and became the seed for our studio. So just try lots of stuff.
I think we had a question over here.
Yeah.
It's been standing there for a while.
Sorry for waiting.
So I am a grad student here. I'm working on my MBA, and I also work here full time. And I'm interested in project management, specifically producing video games. And from what you guys were saying earlier, you wear a lot of hats in a small development team. So I was wondering, if I would prefer to work for an indie developer, what other hats should I be prepared to wear? Like, what job title should I be looking for? Because it seems like producer is only listed in job postings for like really big developers.
I was going to repeat the question. So when looking for a job in indie development, what kind of position should you look for, and what type of hats or other skills do you need to have in order to prepare to get a job at those places?
So you're kind of going to be the grown-up, is the best way to put it there.
Hopefully not, but most likely so.
Yeah, most likely so. And I mean that half jokingly, but basically, you will want a business person around so that you can just not have to worry about any of that stuff. If you're trying to just dive straight into indies, though, like it's going to be very like on-spec thing that you're trying to do here, right? There's a lot of demand for MBA types at the big companies, and that's a good place to go to get experience and have fun. You can use your skill set there. You're going to be doing a lot more hustling if you're working for an indie outfit, and it's like figuring out how you can get a booth at PAX. It's how you're going to pay for whatever software that you need, and it might even be figuring out how you're going to be renting office space or getting pizza for everybody when it's late at night. It's just all of those things that doesn't have to do with writing code or making pretty pictures.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that I do right now that has to do with when you go to submit a game for certification to publish it on a platform, there's like a whole set of, a lot of paperwork to do and a lot of like back and forth with platform managers and representatives. There should always be somebody playing the game and being like, guys, have you actually been paying attention to this part that you're not working on right now? It's completely broken. No one knows about it. Stuff like that. I get donuts on Mondays for everybody. Make sure that we celebrate like team birthdays and anniversaries and stuff like that. Make sure everybody's doing okay, whether it's their personal life or at work or whatever. Kind of just check in on them from time to time. Not in the annoying way that you would stereotypically think of a producer, where they're just kind of hovering over your shoulder all the time, but in just a like, walking in the morning, hey, how's it going? Like, what'd you do over the weekend? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know, trying to be as personable as possible.
There's one thing that you want to not do, which is coming up to the dev team while they're in the middle of whatever their sprint is and being like, guys, crafting is really hot right now. I think we really need to add crafting to the game. I've worked with plenty of executives who kind of see that as like their role, and it's just important to point out that it's not a thing.
There's no idea person. That's not a thing. Like, without a skill, you can't just be the person there being like, well, I have a great idea for a game, and I'm going to get everybody else to make it for me. Like, that's not how it works.
Unless you have lots of millions of dollars.
Well, yeah, unless you're an investor, and then suddenly you become that. But that's what you have to be wary of when you sign up with them, is how controlling they're going to be. Trying to think.
And I would say too, if you're working with a team who's trying to get funding or trying to be working with a publisher, watching Shark Tank is great for this, because you can just see how terrible most people are at pitching investors. But your job is not to show them how cool your thing is. Your job is to show them how much money you're going to give them. And you need to just have everything buttoned down. You need to know the size of your market, what the demand for your thing is, what the ARPU is of all these players, right? How many people you're going to get, what platform.
What's ARPU?
Yeah, exactly. What's You'll have to go look that up. But yeah, right? Like, you need to have all of these money questions answered. And so you're not even asking them anything. If you really think about it, when you stand up in front of investors, you mean like, here's how I'm going to make you $100 million. You'd be a fool not to say yes to this. And then you have all of your ducks in a row there. All of your irons in a row.
And like knowing whichever place you're applying for, like what their goals are and what kind of studio they are and what kind of games they release, what market they're in, a general idea of what's going on in the rest of the industry and the trends, because although you won't want to like pressure everybody into following one, you may still want to know about them so that tangentially you can either avoid problems or find success. Having a wide amount of knowledge about kind of every aspect of everything. It's not easy, and it involves reading a lot of news that you may or may not even care about, but need to know about.
And don't forget, your peers that all also have MBAs and are working in banking are going to be making 5 times more than you, and you have to be okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, you can make a lot more as a programmer in general software than you can in games usually, unless you're a senior programmer, which takes 10, 15 years.
Yep.
So I had a question from Twitter, very broad, but how do you see the future of indie development going? They say, do you think it will overtake AAA? But I think at that point it would almost be AAA. But yeah,
I've heard some people banding around the term triple I. Have you guys heard that one?
Yeah, or AA.
Or double A, yeah.
Just like
Yeah, it's not
the comeback of the mid-sized studio before the inevitable fall of the mid-sized studio.
Pretty much. I'm pretty stoked to see that because growing up, right, like I was more into these games, like right here in the middle. I didn't want to play the biggest games ever. And maybe the little ones I like to play just because they're fun and experimental, but I spent most of my time with these sort of mid-range, mid-size cool games, and it's nice to see them coming back. So wait, is the question, where do we see it going?
where do you see it going?
I see it staying. So there's a cool site called Steam Spy, and you can get a lot of your metrics. You can get a lot of really useful information there. And the person who runs the site, I forget his name. If you guys remember it, let me know.
Georgie?
Is it Georgie? So he basically tackled this indie apocalypse idea, right? There used to be 100 games coming out a year on Steam, and now there's 5,000. Like, there's just too many games out there. Like, I'm not going to be seen, I'm not going to be noticed. And I think what his takeaway was, there are actually the same amount of games as there were when there was, 100 coming out that breach this level of, like, public awareness that are actually kind of cool. So it's not that every single game was now getting a smaller share. It was the same amount of games were still getting the same big share, but you just had to graduate and you actually had to make a product that was worthy of being that thing. And I thought that was really useful.
It's just harder to get noticed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'm not on board with like the idea of an indie apocalypse sort of thing, which is like a common term that's been thrown around the last couple of years, where like at one point in like 2008, 2009, 2010, it was a lot easier, or at least seemed outwardly easier to be a success with a small game on Xbox Live Arcade and things like that, as those platforms were just popping up. And now it's becoming harder and harder as more people have more access to things like Unity and GameMaker and tools that let them build things faster, more easily. In the asset store. Yeah, ProBuilder. Which is just giving people more access to hop into the marketplace, and then there's more chaff to go through before you find something that's good, and it's harder to stand out. I think it's more cyclical, honestly, in which as platforms rise and fall or become more popular or less popular, that changes kind of who you have to target and how you have to operate your studio and what kind of games you have to put out to stand out. I think the indie apocalypse is just like a moment in that cycle in which things are changing, and it's hard to always be adapting. And that kind of goes back to the self-awareness of having to know how you stack up against the competition which you have, and that's always changing.
So we actually have one more question. This is probably the last one because we're nearing the end.
Hi guys, Christopher Jones, I'm Case Panelists here for Pieces of Game Summit. I had a question because one of my favorite games was made in '98, which is Battlezone 2. And they say that it has had problems with hardware because it was pushing so many boundaries that not a lot of players could compete or play it. So how do you determine what hardware specifications you try to market to? Is it based on player base, or is it based on the potential, like, where the game might be able to go?
The question was, how do you determine what hardware... Sorry, say it again.
What hardware you develop for?
Yeah, like what hardware you're targeting and why, and how you determine that. For us, it's really dependent on whatever game we're making, and also the size of your studio or company you work for. Like with us, we know there's no way we can compete with like Naughty Dog in terms of graphical fidelity or size of game or length of game or whatever, and so we're not even going to try to do that because it's just you're setting yourself up to lose immediately. And what we try to do is make something charming, cute, and funny, and that's appropriate for our size. We liken it, or at least like in terms of marketing, we liken it to sort of Pixar, not in terms of us being as popular as Pixar, but in terms of us trying to create something that can be widely enjoyed and be okay for kids to play, but that adults can also play and enjoy and maybe find some things in it that the kids won't even notice. And in terms of picking platforms, it's really just dependent on the game and where we think the audience for that game is, and that's just through a lot of research.
Yeah, I mean, the really broad answer is just market research, right? If you're making a game, because back then, I feel like there wasn't really a whole lot of market research. It was, what's the new hotness? How can we build just the coolest looking thing ever? And then everybody who's into PC culture is just going to buy whatever they need to buy in order to play the game. In some cases, that's probably not true. But nowadays, your answer is like, how many people have a 1080 Ti? Well, there's Steam surveys. You can check that out, right? And then the same thing holds true for how many PS4s are out there? How many Xbox Ones are out there? Should it actually be on both platforms? Is it worth your time developing for both?
And then like which of these platforms is going to give you the best deal in terms of store placement and stuff like that? Because releasing on consoles can be tough if you're not going to get that day one promotion where you have, you know, a full page ad or whatever, or you're front and center on the coming soon or newly released stuff. You can easily get pushed off that page in one day if you don't have the right kind of deals set in place. So that also plays a big part in where you're going to go first, at least.
I heard Warren Spector talking a few years ago, and we were asking him about his next game, and he said, I'm not interested, or we asked him about VR. Like, what do you think about VR and AR? And he said, I'm not interested in any platform except for mobile, because everybody has a phone in their pocket, and the potential reach is just so much greater. I mean, this is, granted, somebody who's already kind of made his fortune and made a reputation for himself, but...
Who can go to Apple and say, I'm Warren Spector, put my game, feature it.
Sure.
And they'll be like, of course.
But regarding like the tech specs, I think he just wanted as many people as possible to play his game and like see it.
Depends on if you care about accessibility or not. And then with the App Store in particular, it may be a huge player base, but it's also very easy to fall off that store pretty quick.
Yeah.
Especially if you've got no featuring at all.
Right.
And then you're making maybe a couple grand if you're lucky.
Sorry, to add on to what you guys are saying, in a more technical respect, when we're choosing what platforms to target for plugin development, it comes down to what's the burden of development. So we have to support our software across whatever we release on, which is similar to what you guys do, but I think a little different in that ours is like a perpetually updated software. So like if it's going to be 10 hours a week just on this one platform that only has a couple thousand people on it, doesn't make sense. So yeah, I'm basically saying the same thing, market research, and adding on to that, looking at how difficult it will be to actually do that. So if porting to some platform is going to be some huge amount of time and only gain you 0.01%.
Yeah, picking the right first platform and then deciding where to go next is like a strategy all of its own.
Yeah, that support cost is real too. Like you got to think about whatever you make right now, you're holding on to that. You're going to have people that are using it. Like one of the games that I worked on, we made a Mac client, and that thing was the bane of my existence because nobody knew anything about Mac. I don't even know how we managed to put that client out there, and it was just constantly problematic. And eventually I just had the link pulled off the website, and it made life so much easier.
I think it's Alt Control GDC is what it's called. If you guys aren't familiar with that, you should check it out. It's really cool. It's at GDC every year. They have a section that's just devoted to showing off really weird games.
Mostly physical games?
Yeah, physical, like really bizarre controllers. Like one of them, it looked like a skee ball thing, and like there was a screen hooked up to it, and like, you know, one of them people were bumping around with big physical things attached to their bodies.
Butt sniffing pugs.
Butt sniffing pugs is the greatest game.
You sniff each other's butts.
Where they have a dog plush and you have to like put your face into its butt to sniff it, and that like controls the game. And then there's a giant tennis ball to move around and stuff.
Yeah,
and on that
you can make
note,
cool stuff like that. You can get a bunch of attention like that, but if your intention is to sell a lot of copies, like that's not a viable strategy.
But if you're like a single developer and you're looking to just drum up attention for yourself and kind of build a brand, as they say, so that you can then later pitch to people and be like, look at all this other stuff I did. It's really cool and people liked it. That's one route.
And that's all the time we have. We have to give away 2 ProBuilder prizes. So I don't know where the raffle jar is. Over here. Real quickly, while we're getting that, I had a question I kind of want to end it on, and you can answer really quickly since we have like a minute left. But how do you see the Midwest playing in the future of game development? And even, I'll keep it broad. How do you see it playing in the industry?
Well, I mean, an event like this means that you're actually making an attempt at doing something cool with it, right? So it's just more doubling down, doing cool stuff like this. And then every company likes tax breaks too, so probably that.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago is pretty solid in terms of this. We have a lot of small studios, a lot of indies, and then we've also got NetherRealm and Wargaming and bigger studios like that. We have a club/group called Indie City Games that meets bi-monthly that has, yes, it's a joke about Windy City.
That's a great pun. I love it.
That meets bi-monthly, and we have like talks and opportunities for people to come there and just show off their games and get feedback and stuff like that. And then we run a lot of other things. There's a video game art gallery called VGA Gallery in Chicago now, where they just show off cool prints of games or have live exhibition and plays and developer Q&A and stuff like that. There's a lot of events in Chicago and a lot of cool people facilitating them. There's an event called Bit Bash that's yearly. It's a festival specifically for local weird games where people can go and play, and there's drinks and dancing and stuff like that, and food trucks, and I don't know. You just have to build a community around all aspects of it and not be exclusive. You want to be inclusive as possible.
I don't know a lot about the Midwest game dev scene specifically because I work in Seattle, but I do know that you can do contract work remotely from anywhere. And the most important thing, if you're going to pursue that option, is you just need to find the right people and build a strong team. And if a client believes in you and you have work to show them, then you can work out of Kansas or South America. I actually forwarded a contract to a friend who lives in South America, and he killed it. So just find the right people. The right people are everywhere. I'm sure there are people in this room that would love to work with you that are talented if you're an aspiring developer. So link up, start building some stuff, and start sending emails.
Oh, and don't call yourself an aspiring developer if you can help it. Just if you've made anything, you're a game developer. You don't have to have any special qualifications. I probably shouldn't even be up here. So
as an aspiring developer myself, West Coast East Coast. Where we are is great because cost of living is super cheap. And if you're a contractor getting started, that's a huge plus. So don't feel like you need to go out to San Francisco or someplace equally expensive to get your foot in the door. You can do it here.
Awesome. So thank everyone for showing up, and
Thank you.
for these
Thank you very
panels.
much.
thank you.